James Baldwin once said, "I'm not in despair, I am enraged. There has been a breakdown, a betrayal of the social contract in Western life, and people are grabbing onto things and holding onto what they think they can get, and stepping all over their neighbors because they are panic-stricken. People hoard all this because they don't have anything else. They don't really believe in it, and they kill to get it. But that proves the moral bankruptcy which translates itself into actual bankruptcy of the world in which we live. We have yet to understand that if I am starving, you are in danger. People think that my danger makes them safe. They are in trouble." The Polycrisis is an interdisciplinary framework that offers an effective way of holistically assessing multiple interconnected crises. The term refers to the complex interplay of economic, social, environmental, technological, and political factors. The rise of authoritarianism illustrates the dynamics of these interrelationships. The information technology revolution has reshaped societal norms, eroded traditional communities, and triggered an identity crisis. This upheaval has caused disorientation and fueled the rise of cultural conflicts that challenge the power of urban elites. After centuries of destructive human activities, the fault lines of our political, economic, and social systems are becoming increasingly apparent. Humans are destroying the natural world and unraveling the social ties that unite us. In just over 50 years, humans have altered 3.8 billion years of evolution. In that time, we've lost almost 70% of wildlife populations, and more than 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction. The social fabric is being frayed by inequality, and democracy is under threat from illiberal politics. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing." Despite ominous warnings and incentives to act, our efforts have been woefully insufficient. We are not acting because our systems prevent us from grasping the perilousness of our trajectory. We are constrained by myopia, blinded by greed, and blinkered by growth. Corporate power, politics, and digital media impede our efforts to address the issues. We fail to acknowledge the dangers of our reliance on dirty energy or the extent to which our economic and social systems are rife with broken assumptions. The head of Land Climate Dynamics at ETH Zurich in Switzerland starkly asserts, "We are in the middle of a crisis." The fact is that we are facing multiple crises, all at the same time. These crises are described differently depending upon the discipline or vocational lens through which they are perceived. So biologists call it the sixth great extinction. Politicians use the term cascading crises, while Europeans describe eco-social collapse, collapsologie in France. It's also been called the Great Unraveling, the Great Turning, the Great Simplification, the Shift, or simply the end. The interaction of environmental, social, economic, political, and technological crises is comprehensively referred to as a global polycrisis. The term originated in the 1970s and has been popularized by the historian Adam Tooze. In a 2022 paper, researcher Michael Lawrence, Scott Jaswood, and Thomas Homer Dixon characterize the global polycrisis as entanglements between multiple global crises that diminish humanity's prospects. They argue that global polycrisis is a necessary and productive framework with which to understand and address major problems afflicting humanity today. In 2023, the World Economic Forum, WEF, Global Risks Report, explained the need for the term polycrisis, saying, "We need a new descriptor for the multiple crises that we're facing." They define a polycrisis as the compounding interaction of present and future risks. The elements of these interrelated crises interact, entangle, and mutually reinforce one another. Salient individual aspects of the polycrisis include the climate emergency, COVID-19, inequality, polarization, Russia's war in Ukraine, and Israel's war in Gaza and Lebanon. Aspects of the polycrisis interact in several ways. The impacts are experienced differently depending upon the local conditions and the networks of connected risks at play. Davies and Hobson are two researchers who identified 7 challenges presented by the polycrisis. Number 1 is simultaneity, the co-occurrence of multiple crises or a succession of crises by which one is in the shadow or affects the other. 2, feedback loops. Several crises interact in both foreseen and unexpected ways. 3, amplification, the interactions between separate crises that magnify effects. 4, unboundedness, the blurring of the distinction between crises in time and space as different problems bleed over each other and merge. 5, layering, the concerns of interest groups related to each distinct crisis overlap to create layered social problems. 6, action at cross purposes, the ways that addressing one crisis impedes the resolution of another, either through demands on scarce resources and attention or through conflicting solutions. 7, morphism, emergent properties that come together synergistically to create situations that are more than the sum of their parts, i.e., beyond the sum of a series of crises. The rise of right-wing populist authoritarianism in Europe and North America provides an excellent illustration of the interconnected dynamics of a polycrisis. This movement is at least in part a response to radical change augured by the neoliberal globalization project. However, its causes and sequelae are a complex, interconnected web of social, political, economic, and environmental factors. Journalist and author Fareed Zakaria's newest book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present, argues that liberalism is a revolutionary movement, and the 21st century is a revolutionary age. He cautions us not to mistake the undertow, counter-revolution, for the wave. The book chronicles the history of revolution in the Western world over the past 4 centuries. He looks at Dutch and English revolutions in the 17th century, as well as French Revolution in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Zakaria argues that all these revolutions were driven by information. In an episode of Battle Lines, Zakaria sets the stage for America in the West in a new age of revolutions. Revolutions, he says, are dramatic, often blood-soaked milestones of history, the moments of sudden change when the old order is replaced with something strange and new. There are political revolutions, the abrupt overthrow of states and regimes driven by mass protest and sometimes extreme violence. We think of America in 1776, France in 1789, Russia in 1917. And then there are cultural, economic, and technological revolutions that change the way we think about ourselves and how we live. The classic example is the 19th century Industrial Revolution, but we're used to thinking of these as episodes from the past. What if, Zakaria asks, we are now entering our own age of revolutions? Zakaria argues the rise of populism we are seeing is not a revolution. He believes it's a counter-revolutionary movement born in response to the anxiety people are experiencing and is a backlash against globalized information technology. Counter-revolutionary movements accompany revolutions because profound change is highly disruptive. While the educated and urban may benefit from recent changes, others have been left behind. Zakaria explains, America has always had this kind of amazing inventiveness and innovation, but for people in the bottom third of America, it's a much tougher life than it is in any other rich country. To explain how America finds itself in this predicament, Zakaria references Pascal's idea of the infinite abyss, which addresses the spiritual crisis in post-Christian West. Once the center of Western life, religious communities are disappearing. As Zakaria points out, however, people are moving away from the tradition and religion by choice. Churches would not be empty if people went to church, and it is the act of people choosing freely not to go to church that makes them empty. We are abandoning the traditions that were once the center of our lives, and as Zakaria explains, we haven't filled that hole in the heart. The loss of community and the state of disconnection from the loss of shared religious affiliations is being exacerbated by sociopolitical changes. We no longer rally around common concerns. Global geopolitical preoccupations have abated. During the Cold War, communism and the Soviet Empire united the Western world. We rallied together to defend freedom and democracy. As these concerns receded, we unplugged from the social matrix and plugged into digital technology. We substituted real-life interaction with remote work and virtual recreation. Over the past 4 centuries, the disruption caused by revolutionary change has almost always been accompanied by an identity crisis. In the 21st century, our sense of identity is being uprooted by rapid economic and technological change. This affects how we see ourselves and interpret our experiences. As explained by Zakaria, issues surrounding identity stir people's souls. Identity is at the heart of the brand of nationalism we see in the right today. But the current identity crisis is an iteration of a reoccurring historical theme. Over the last 4 centuries, technological and economic progress has produced identity transformations in Britain, the Netherlands, and the US. According to Zakaria, these 2 structural revolutions almost always produce a kind of identity revolution. He argues that change produces a backlash as people yearn for the simple old ways, what he calls the politics of nostalgia. Those identity revolutions almost always become part of a cultural maelstrom that then produces a backlash, and what I would argue is what we're now living through. It's a backlash of 30 years of extraordinary change, economically, technologically, and in terms of identity in the Western world, but even beyond, Zakaria said, adding, we're moving up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've created mass middle classes in much of the Western world, and that was the historic aspiration of the left, and we've moved to a post-materialist politics that seems much more defined by identity issues. Support for the right is rooted in their opposition to immigration. Less educated white people, including a disproportionate share of those on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, are vulnerable to fear-mongering. Sandel says people are drawn to racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. They identify with the right's adoption of the white nationalist conspiracy known as the Great Replacement Theory or Great Replacement Theory. This is the false belief that non-white immigrants are replacing white political power as part of a global plot. This concern permeates the right in both Europe and America, where polls show that immigration is at the top of the problem list. People are deeply gripped by our immigration, Zakaria said, adding, the issue is rocket fuel for the populist right. People are upset about what they perceive as borderless world of globalization. People blame immigration for their woes, and they reject the liberal agenda with its emphasis on multiculturalism and diversity. Right-leaning leaders capitalize on the antipathy towards immigrants to enact draconian policies. Fomenting hatreds for immigration has impacted policy in America. Sarah Rapucci, Freedom House's senior director of research and analysis, summarized the Trump administration's 4 years in office as being defined by discriminatory and often arbitrary or abusive immigration policies. According to a Freedom House report, when it comes to immigration, the U.S. is now equivalent to Ghana and below Albania. Immigration is also being weaponized. Good examples of this dynamic are at play in both Europe and America. After being propped up by Russia, the Belarusian dictatorship streamed Iraqi migrants into EU countries. In the U.S., Republicans publicly rail against immigration while blocking immigration reform legislation. While populism is more common on the right, it sometimes comes from the left, as we see in Mexico and Argentina. Whether from the right or the left, populists are all outsiders. These people are leading rebellions against the power of the liberal cosmopolitan urban elite. In the US, France, Germany, India, and Turkey, politicians draw support by pandering to the ire of the less educated rural people. These people have deep-seated animosity towards educated city dwellers, and these frustrations are evident in Brexit and the populist support for Trump, Le Pen, Bolsonaro, Modi, and Erdogan. Zachary explains the resentment towards the liberal agenda is due to the perception that change is coming top-down from a bunch of political elites. In his 1926 story, The Rich Boys, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They think, deep in their hearts, that they are better." 4 decades of neoliberalism have spawned an ideology that frames financial success as a function of individual agency and merit. In a Guardian article, Will Hutton wrote, "The rich were led to believe in the delusion of entitlement. They believe they deserve their wealth and privilege. They even believe that they have the right to transgress social mores as they choose." The political philosopher Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit, explains how the dividing line between elite and non-elite, well-educated, poorly educated, rich or poor, is about winners and losers. In an interview with Glenn Lurie, Sandel said, "It is not an equal playing field, so the winners don't deserve their success, and this is driving the sense of grievance against elites." America offers the false promise of a meritocracy, the idea that hard work propels people to be successful. But it's not borne out in practice. Everybody's chances are not equal. In a 1958 book titled The Rise of the Meritocracy, Michael Young reviewed these structural inequalities and correctly predicted a populist revolt against the meritocracy. Like Zachariah, Sandel sees the cause of the counter-revolutionary rebellion against the elites as both economic and cultural. The animus, the anger, the grievance against well-educated elites, the professional classes that a great many working people felt after years, and here's where it connects to the economy, it's cultural and it's economic, because many of these voters were the ones who suffered from 4 decades of the kind of neoliberal globalization project that involved the outsourcing of jobs, stagnant real wages. And this took place over 4 decades. Right-leaning politicians are leveraging the malaise caused by social change. They're fueling culture wars by amplifying conflict between liberals and conservatives, and in the process, they're deepening the divides that separate us. Astrophysicist and best-selling author Neil deGrasse Tyson references climate change to explain how culture has become entwined with politics. Tyson says, "We now have people where the facts of climate change conflict with their political view. It's really a cultural worldview that manifests in politics. Your cultural worldview might be, I don't want to lose my coal job. I'm heavily invested in oil companies. I like oil and I don't care that it pollutes. So that is your cultural standpoint. And that standpoint resonates with certain industries. And if you're a politician who wants to favor those industries, you'll come out and you'll say that global warming is not anything that I care about if it's going to constrict these cultural and political plans that I have." According to Zachariah, the left is no longer winning the culture war because it pushed too fast, too far. The climate crisis, biodiversity loss, inequality, and other elements of the Polycrisis demand that we act quickly, and this exacerbates the counter-revolutionary backlash. The result is a groundswell of antipathy towards the woke agenda from people who believe that they are losing their country. Voter priorities have shifted such that culture is now a more important issue than the economy. This is clear in the U.S., where the incumbent president has historically low approval ratings despite America's exceptional economic performance. Zachariah explained that the less educated people who constitute the conservative base are upset that they earn a tiny fraction of what knowledge workers earn. Revolutions produce rising inequality, he said. However, he points to the growing specter of fascism in Sweden's egalitarian society, causing him to conclude that the prevailing dissatisfaction is about something more than just the economy and inequality. The issue for many is dissatisfaction with a changing culture. The reason that the right appeals to large swaths of voters has everything to do with the fact that they are in what Zakaria calls the age of culture warfare. The right is framing issues through the lens of culture to exploit and exacerbate divisions for political gain. They support a range of culture-based legislative initiatives, but as Tyson explains, if you bring your personal truth onto the level of legislative truth, then that is the beginning of the end of a free democracy.